In Mark's Gospel, chapter 4, we see the wonderful account of Jesus calming a storm at sea. Picking up at verse 35 of Mark 4, it says, "On the same day, when evening had come, he said to them, 'Let us cross over to the other side.' Now when they had left the multitude, they took him along in the boat as he was. And other little boats were also with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that it was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on a pillow. And they awoke him and said to him, 'Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?' Then he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Peace, be still.' And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. But he said to them, 'Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?' And they feared exceedingly and said to one another, 'Who can this be, that even the wind and the sea obey him?' When the disciples were saying, 'Who can this be, that even the wind and the sea obey him?' they were probably thinking of Psalm 89 and verse 9, where, speaking of God himself, it says, 'You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them.' This was a revelation to the disciples of the divinity of Jesus, the divine authority that Jesus operated in. But I want to look at how it was that Jesus himself was so calm, so at peace in the middle of a storm that was so severe that even the 4 experienced fishermen who were among the disciples on the boat were terrified for their lives, to the extent that they had to wake Jesus up. Remember, Peter, Andrew, James and John had grown up around the sea all their lives. They'd been out on the boats fishing with their fathers. They knew the sea. They knew how to handle a boat. They knew how to deal with extreme weather situations. These 4 men, including the rest of the disciples, are terrified. That's how severe this storm is. And yet Jesus is perfectly at peace. He can sleep even in the middle of everything that is going on. Well, let's just look at the context in which this happens in the first place. Remember, Jesus says, "Let us cross over to the other side." This is Jesus who said, "I only do what I see my Father doing." He says, "My meat is to do the will of my Father who sent me." So Jesus saying, "Let us cross over to the other side," is Jesus saying, "I want to do the will of my Father." In crossing over to the other side, we are going to do the will of my Father. The reason he was going to the other side is because the Father was sending him to set free the Gadarene demoniac when he casts out the legion of demons and sends them into the herd of pigs on the other side of the lake. Jesus is doing what he has been told to do by the Father. So the first thing is that Jesus is in the perfect will of his Father. That is the first key to operating in peace. But there's more to it than just doing the will of the Father. I want you to turn, please, to John's Gospel, chapter 8, and verse 28, when it says, "Jesus said to them, 'When you lift up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he, and that I do nothing of myself, but as my Father sent me, I speak these things. And he who sent me is with me. The Father has not left me alone, for I always do those things that please him.'" In everything that Jesus did, he wasn't just operating in the will of his Father. Jesus was operating in peace because he knew that the Father was always with him. So no matter how severe the storm was on the Sea of Galilee, Jesus knew that his Father was with him. Jesus, at the end of his life, faced a far, far greater storm than the storm at sea. Jesus, we know, was betrayed by Judas Iscariot. He was denied by one of his closest friends, Peter. He was deserted by all of the rest of the disciples, all those who'd said, even if we have to die with you, we'll never leave you. All the disciples said the same, not just Peter. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus cried out 3 times, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. He surrendered himself completely to the will of the Father. Why? Because Jesus was trusting himself to the one who judges justly. And Jesus knew that even in everything that was about to happen, the Father was with him. Throughout his whole life, Jesus had operated in perfect peace. You never see Jesus flustered. You never see Jesus anxious. You never see Jesus fearful. Jesus always operates in perfect peace. They tried to take Jesus and throw him off a cliff, but he just walked right through the middle of them. Why? Because his time had not yet come. He knew that everything was in the perfect will of his Father, who was always with him. Even as Jesus faced the cross, we know that he could face it knowing that the Father was with him. John chapter 16 and verse 31, Jesus says to the disciples, do you now believe? Indeed, the hour is coming, yes, has now come, that you will be scattered, each to his own, and will leave me alone. And yet I am not alone, because the Father is with me. These things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. Even when he is betrayed, even when he is denied, even when he is deserted by all those who swore they would follow him no matter what, even when there was no human support whatsoever, even when the situation seemed as bleak as it is possible to be, Jesus was at perfect peace. Why? Because, as he says, the Father is with me. I am not alone. Jesus knew what was coming. Jesus knew Judas was going to betray him. He knew Peter was going to deny him. He knew the disciples were going to desert him. He knew he was going to be put on trial and accused falsely. He knew he was going to be mocked. He knew that men were going to spit in his face. He knew that men were going to pull the beard from his face. He knew that he was going to be beaten with fists and with rods. He knew that he was going to be mocked and beaten by the Roman soldiers. He knew that he was going to have the crown of thorns rammed onto his head so that his scalp tore right open. He knew that he was going to be scourged. A scourging that was so severe many people didn't even survive the scourging. He knew that he was going to be made to carry his cross to the place of the skull, Golgotha, and there be crucified. And there be mocked as he hung, bleeding and dying. He knew, even with all of that coming up, that the Father was with him, and he trusted himself to the Father who judges justly, even in the middle of the worst possible, imaginable storm. Jesus had peace. The only time when we see Jesus cry out in any sort of anguish is when he cried out, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? As he who knew no sin was made to be sin for us, and the sin obscured that relationship, blocked that relationship with the Father and with the Holy Spirit in that awful moment as Jesus bore our separation from God. Why? So that we could be reunited with God, so that we could again have fellowship with the Father, so that we could be taken from death to life and receive the gift of everlasting life instead of the wages of sin. Jesus bore that separation. It's the only time Jesus ever experienced what it was like to not know the presence of the Father. But he did that for you and he did that for me, so that we can be reunited with God. And now Jesus says to us, as the Father sent me, so I send you. Remember, Jesus said, I know that he who sent me is always with me. That means if Jesus sends us as the Father sent him, and the Father was always with him who he had sent, we know that Jesus is always with us who he has sent. Jesus makes a wonderful promise in Matthew chapter 28, in that wonderful, wonderful Great Commission. Beginning at verse 18 of Matthew 28, it says, Jesus came and spoke to them, saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Jesus had perfect peace even as he stood before the high priest, as he stood before the Jewish council, as he stood before those who mocked him and falsely accused him. Jesus had perfect peace when he stood before Pontius Pilate. He said to him, you would have no power over me unless it were given to you from above. Jesus had perfect peace in the middle of the worst storm anyone in history has ever known. And this same Jesus had peace because he knew the Father was with him. Whatever storm you are facing right now, whether it's financial, whether it's your health, whether it's a family crisis, whatever it is, an employment situation, whatever storm you are facing, know this: you can have perfect peace because Jesus has promised, lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Jesus was able to sleep on a pillow on the stern of the boat in a fierce storm at sea because he knew the Father was with him. He who sent you is with you. So be at peace. Be at peace. Be at peace, because Jesus is with you always. God bless you.